I think above all, Homo sapiens likes to survive. And I think ultimately, the more we understand the facts and reality of this, the more likely we are to deal with it, and that gives me hope. The one thing I emphasize, and I'll talk about it in the show, is that we need to kind of check our ideologies and our belief systems at the door. Look at evidence and don't come to this issue with beliefs. I don't think belief has anything to do with these questions of factual physical reality. And I see climate change as being a question of evidence. We've got many, many decades worth of evidence collected by smart women and men from around the world that indicate there is such a thing as climate change. 97% of the specialists in the field think that there is climate change. And I think that in general, in spite of all the noise and confusion in society, we are more prone to accept evidence and information than we are to deny it. There's natural variation in the climate driven by how the Earth moves around the sun and how the axis of the Earth wobbles. This is not generally known. We assume that the Earth goes around the sun in the same way all the time, but it's been understood for quite a while now that there's something called the Milankovitch cycles. A mathematician from Serbia figured this out when he sat in a prisoner of war camp. I think it was in World War I. And he figured out that the Earth doesn't move around the sun in the same way all the time. And that changes the climate through that natural variation. Also, the Earth's axis wobbles a little bit. That's natural variation. On top of that, we have human-caused variation in play right now. And we are 40% outside normal variation when it comes to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the only reason for that, and no skeptic, no denier has ever had an answer for this, for that fact, is the fossil fuel waste going into the atmosphere. We're basically using the atmosphere as a free garbage dump for the byproducts of our combustion. And that's what's shifting the climate. So yes, there has been natural climate variation for a long time. A lot of the variance in the climate is in conditions that our race of people has never lived in. I was just looking something up on Wikipedia when I was outside clearing my head, and the climate has been warmer than it is now in times past. Back in the dinosaur days, for example, we didn't live there. We live here. We live within a certain framework of hot and cold and wet and dry. That's what our civilization has adapted to, especially in the 10,000 years of agricultural civilization. And unless we want extreme disruption of our food systems, our coastlines with rising sea levels, unless we are prepared to adapt to all of those severe changes, we need to try and stabilize what we're doing to at least slow the pace of change down. As minimum, we need to slow down the way things are changing right now. There's some people who will always stay in their ideological pockets. They'll never get out of that. They'll never be able to think in terms of the evidence. But for those who are able to think in terms of the evidence, the problem is simply that there's a lot of confusion in the world that's been put forth by vested interests who want the world to stay exactly as it is. Vested interests who say, hey, look, we're making plenty of money with the status quo right now. We don't want that to change. And that includes the fossil fuel industry is probably the single, the fossil fuel and utility industry. Well, let's take the utilities out of that for a minute. The fossil fuel industry is not in the business of renewable energy. Fossil fuel industry is in the business of selling oil, coal, and natural gas. So they say, well, our job is to protect shareholder interest. I understand that. But they want things to stay the same. Even so, you have a guy like Rex Tillerson, our current Secretary of State, who is the former CEO of ExxonMobil, who has said in front of Congress in the past month and a half, that he recognizes that there's a problem called climate change and that the fossil fuels have something to do with this. So he accepts that, but in order to protect economic interests, there's been an awful lot of money that's been thrown at confusing the public by those companies. And there's a long, deep accumulation of evidence about this. Essentially what's happened is they have taken the same strategies that the cigarette makers did decades ago. Way back in the 60s, when the cigarette makers were being threatened by reduced cigarette sales because cigarettes were a threat to your health, they came up with a plan to say, let's just keep the public confused, because as long as they're confused, it will slow down the reduction of our sales. And literally the same strategy, and in some cases the exact same people who were hired for those cigarette campaigns have been employed by the fossil fuel industry through consulting companies to keep the public confused about this issue. And so the premise has been, well, as long as they're confused, then they won't push too hard on Congress, or they won't do anything to change our various, our dominances in these industries. But what I find enormously hopeful, to come back to the question of hope, is, did anybody see the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago? There was an op-ed essay by Jim Baker, the former Secretary of State and Treasury Secretary, co-signed by Henry Paulson, the former Treasury Secretary, and it was something about, can't remember the exact title, but they characterized it as, this is a conservative's answer to the problem of climate change. And these guys came out, and it was co-signed by a bunch of corporate chieftains, and they said, we need a tax on carbon in the economy. That's how we deal with this. This is conservatives saying we need a tax on carbon in the economy. And the point being that the way carbon costs our society in terms of defense, because we have to defend the oil supplies coming from the Middle East, the way it costs our society in terms of respiratory health, which is measurable and demonstrable and has been well studied, the way it costs the environment something. They're saying all of these costs are externalized. They're spread through different parts of the economy. When you buy a gallon of gas at the pump, these costs don't show up. You pay for it in different ways in different parts of the economy. And so these strong mainline conservatives were saying, we need to tax this. We know we need to deal with climate change. We have a problem. It has to be addressed. We think this is the best way to deal with it. And interestingly enough, that's the same strategy that the environmental liberal wing has been talking about for a long time too. We need a carbon tax. So eureka, the right and the left agree we need a carbon tax to level the playing field and deal with this issue.